We are now live with the webinar Conspiracies Amid the COVID-19 Crisis.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and thank you to our speakers for joining us for today's discussion. My name is Alina Brickman. I'm the Director of EU Affairs at B'nai International. For those of you less familiar with, we are an advocacy and service organization working globally to safeguard Jewish life, combat anti-Semitism, but also play our small role in ensuring our general health of society. And on this point of societal health, I think the discussion today on conspiracy myths during the COVID-19 crisis could not be more relevant. The current crisis has exacerbated a lot of the challenges posed by disinformation and has bolstered the emergence of a plethora of conspiracy theories, many of which are anti-Semitic in nature, which only has lent more weight to this expression that anti-Semitism is a mutating virus. It's our hope that despite this negative background, we will be able to think constructively about potential solutions and the way that civil society can play a constructive role. That said, I am glad to co-moderate the talk today with our colleague Ilan Selby, who is our director, who is our EU Affairs Fellow.
Hi everyone, and welcome also from my side. Before we get started, allow me to introduce our speakers. MEP Sergei Lagodinsky, who will help us frame this discussion, is a Green member of the European Parliament from Germany. He is Vice Chair of the Committee on Legal Affairs and of the Anti-Semitism Working Group. Ms. Katharina von Schnurbein is the European Commission Coordinator for Combating Anti-Semitism, with her portfolio including liaising with Jewish communities, member states, policymakers and NGOs to find effective solutions to tackle Jew hatred. Milan Zubicek manages public policy and government relations at the Brussels office of Google, so we look forward to his input on how IT companies are making sense of the current situation. Iris Boyer is the Deputy Head of Technology, Communications and Education at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and Dave Rich is the Policy Director of the Community Security Trust UK, a British charity working to ensure the safety of the Jewish community, as well as to provide and best practices beyond that. Thank you all for being here, and please, MEP Lagodinsky, let me pass the floor over to you.
Well, thank you very much. This is a great pleasure to be here and to be surrounded by such experts on the topic. I will only say a couple of words regarding how we perceive it, maybe more from a parliamentarian side, from a political side, but also because European Parliament is a place where so many different perspectives get together. And those perspectives are both political, but also geographical. And that's why it's an interesting kind of an observation laboratory for various trends. And the trend that we're seeing now, and the one we're talking about today, is something, I don't even call it conspiracy theories, I call it conspiracy fantasies, because I think even in the framing the term, we should be careful. It's not about, and our experts probably will confirm that maybe not, but it's not about kind of a very cohesive and always cohesive theory with hypotheses and arguments that solidly support it. It's very often something very emotional, but something that gives structure to our mental state and channels our fears and fantasies. It is important from my perspective to see this as something that does not come and go with a crisis. We have conspiracy fantasies looming in our society throughout years. I've done research on anti-Semitism. I've been active in terms of anti-Semitism, but also racism and conspiracy thinking is quite widespread, maybe not always visible among population. It's interesting also to see and to talk about the relationship and the red line between conspiracy theories and fantasies on the one hand, and something which we want to see, and something which is part of also a progressive agenda and regressive agenda on both sides, which is a critique of our systems, critique of our society, putting into question something which is established. And that is something that, to be personal here, makes my life very difficult. Because of course, especially being part of something that deems itself a progressive force, something that wants to change societies and to change our world, it is very difficult to see and to draw the line and to tell someone not to represent certain views. And there I'm looking forward, and I'm looking for advice from this panel on where and how we draw the line, so that our political debate is still possible, but is clear and is constructive. This brings me back to one tension that we're seeing, especially during this crisis, and this is the tension between freedom of speech on the one hand and not very constructive speech on the other hand. Let's put it mildly, and we can go up to the hate speech. Doing resolutions now and monitoring rule of law situation in Hungary, in Poland, and many other countries, we see precisely the tension, and we're actually subjected to the tension. On the one hand, I myself criticize very much disinformation, which is partly a founding stone for many conspiracy philosophies and conspiracy fantasies. And on the other hand, we have to address the situation that we had in Hungary, for example, where any disinformation or fake information about combating the crisis was banned and criminalized by up to 5 years of prison. So this is kind of the everyday ambivalency and dilemmas of politicians who have to, on the one hand, regulate, and on the other hand, tolerate certain views and certain expressions. I'm sure you will be also talking about, of course, the accessibility and kind of a digital normalization of such and kind of self-normalization of such theories through the digital realm is something that is, of course, also a point which is very important. I think, to sum it up, the interesting topics that are politically interesting for us, from my perspective, are, of course, the causes, the root causes of conspiracy fantasies, especially in times of crisis, the functions of those fantasies, and also the impact of it on our society, because if we don't estimate the real impact on all of us, and it can have an impact on any of us, and regardless of minority or not, we will not be able to address the phenomenon itself. So I thank you very much, Brith. I thank you, both moderators, the chairs who invited me, and I'm truly looking forward to our debate. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Sergey, for your introduction. I love your point about the language that we use in speaking about conspiracies, and I think you're absolutely right that conspiracy fantasies or perhaps myths are a better formulation because they don't give legitimacy to the thinking. As well as this fine line between questioning and presenting alternative realities, basically. I do hope to tackle both the ideas of root causes and the impact of conspiracy theories moving forward in the conversation. If time allows you, I would love for you to stay throughout the discussion and signal whether you have any remarks at any point. That said, I would like to begin by getting let's say, a broad perspective from the side of the European Commission about the way that the Commission is thinking about these big topics: disinformation, conspiracies, digital safety, radicalization, because even before the coronavirus, obviously, these were really high on the agenda. So perhaps, Katerina, you could give us a bit of an overview of how these topics are tied together in the Commission's thinking, especially since even earlier today, we had quite good timing. And the European Commission put out communication particularly on disinformation. So perhaps you can also touch on that.
Yes, thank you very much, Alina. It's a real pleasure to be here with Najbrit and with all of the esteemed colleagues on the panel. Sergey, you already mentioned quite a few issues that are indeed also in part of the reasoning behind the Commission's policy with regards to addressing disinformation. Indeed, it didn't start only now. There was an action plan already in 2018 against disinformation, and one of the decisions taken then was to establish an EU observatory on disinformation, and in fact it was launched on the 1st of June. And part of that is our platforms, the Commission supporting financially independent fact checkers to ensure that actually, this information can be fact checked and the correct information can be put up. We have to, I think, look at the broader picture with regards to where this leads to. It's in a way a threat to democracy. Coronavirus and the fact that we were all home and much more online has only highlighted an issue that was there before, that is a threat to democracy if it is not tackled in a proper sense. We know that conspiracy theories or conspiracy myths rather were at the center also of some of the terrorist attack, like for example the attack on the synagogue of Halle. So the link between conspiracy myths on the one side and radicalization, and then committing a hate crime is very short. Therefore, we have to look at this bigger picture with regards to other policies as well. And you may also know that we are in the process of revising the so-called Digital Service Act, where there should be a new framing also with regards to the responsibility of the platforms when it comes to disinformation, to conspiracy myths, and also with regards to hate speech. And I think it's important to understand the difference between hate speech that is illegal according to European legislation when it incites to violence, and on the other side, information that may not be illegal but still harmful. And it's so difficult to tackle, especially the latter one. Now, of course, the first one is also an issue, and there is a code of conduct with regards to take down within 24 hours illegal hate speech. But when it comes to the harmful content, where some of the ideas may be coded either, or they are not illegal as such, but can lead to radicalization or to harmful behavior when it's about swallowing bleach, to counter the coronavirus. And in fact, for example, apparently in Belgium, they have registered 15% increase of incidents with bleach. So there is a real threat to or can be bodily harm or threat to life. So it's important, I think, to understand it. Also, we have another factor. It's not only about disinformation come from within the EU, but also foreign actors and certain third countries, in particular also Russia and China, that have engaged in a targeted influence and disinformation campaigns here in the EU and the neighborhood, and even on a more global scale. And it's something where Europe has to stand up and put its foot down. The motivation behind it is very broad, and I think it can go from economic gain to wanting to cause public harm, but also, of course, political interests. And then, of course, always also the idea of conspiracy, of hatred that goes against certain ethnic and religious groups, in particular, also in the past against the Jews. So we have to look at these different grounds for disinformation as well. There are different areas in which the Commission operates. We have, for example, a very effective rapid alert system already in place between member states and the EU institutions about disinformation. We are talking to the platforms, and as I said, within the Digital Service Act, there will be a certain framing also in terms of legal responsibility, and platforms have also reacted in the Corona crisis now to push information coming from legitimate sources, in particular when it comes to health-related issues on Corona. We are financing these fact checkers platforms, which we think is really important. That, you know, take down is one thing, but when it comes to conspiracy myths, actually taking down may reinforce the point of those who place the information. So supporting fact checkers that are independent and that can actually put up a wall that people have to read before they come to the myth is something relevant as well. Maybe so much for the beginning on the concrete steps that have also been discussed today by Vice President Jourova and High Representative Borrell in the press room, and where I think this is a really important step forward to address this issue Europe-wide. Thank you.
So maybe, thank you, Katerina. I think this provided us a really useful background in terms of understanding where the Commission sits on these issues and how they connect a little bit, what's being done currently. I would perhaps then move to IRIS. The Institute for Strategic Dialogue has put out really in-depth briefings on disinformation during the COVID-19 crisis. Perhaps you could speak at first just broadly, what are the general trends you've seen, how disinformation connects with conspiracy theories, how this fit into the broader picture, generally just what you've observed in these past couple of months, basically.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Alina, and thanks for the invitation. Perhaps I would like to start by kind of outlining our approach to tackling disinformation really broadly. So an important point is that at ISD, given our specific issue set, we basically look at disinformation through the specific lens of the intersection of disinformation with extremism, hate, and polarization. And the reason for that is because basically these issues threaten social cohesion and they tend to erode trust in democratic values as well. And we believe without trust in democratic values and models, there cannot be durable peace. So that's sort of the starting point of our approach to tackling disinformation. Another important point is that obviously new technologies have fundamentally changed the way that we communicate, but they have also changed the way we consume information drastically. And so this actually creates a unique set of new challenges. And without having a clear understanding of this new information ecosystem, and also understanding how technologies are used by sometimes malign actors to sow discord, for instance, and also the role they might play themselves, the companies, sometimes unintentionally, obviously, I mean, unintentionally, hopefully. We are also unable to build coherent and effective responses if we don't understand it in the most granular way possible. So our approach for this reason is really first to invest efforts in research. So we have a department called Digital Analysis Unit, and this department basically leverages marketing, but also bespoke tools combined with subject matter expertise with a view to analyze what shapes disinformation takes, but also who's behind disinformation, where this is happening, on which platforms in different ways, and which techniques are being used. We also try to analyze the intention behind this disinformation, whether it's for commercial or political purposes, for instance, as Katarina mentioned, or to push a specific agenda, or to target and undermine individuals or specific groups. And we are also trying to analyze whether we are seeing coordination or foreign interference, for instance, whether we are witnessing technological automated support or not. Yeah, this kind of analysis. Particularly in our analysis of the COVID-19 crisis information, we are also trying to pay a particular attention to whether influencers play a specific role in the penetration of this disinformation. The second point is that we try to design prevention and intervention strategies. That's sort of our second pillar in terms of our approach. And this prevention and intervention strategies are obviously underpinned by the real-time research I just mentioned. And so, for instance, this kind of programming can range, digital citizenship education or media and information literacy resources for educators, for young people, or for parents. But they can also be about coalition building and advocacy and campaigning efforts, ranging to direct messaging interventions to at-risk audiences, for instance. And finally, our second levy, in a way, is we try to assess technological companies and governments' policy responses to this issue. And we try to brief their decision makers as well as the broader civil society practitioners, ecosystem that we are part of, on what we are seeing and how we can collectively respond. And so in all these different streams, we really try to focus on coalition building and having a multi-stakeholder engagement approach. So for instance, in an ongoing project where we sort of look at disinformation or potential disinformation in the context of the US elections, we are currently using a unique crowdsourced model of data sharing that's super interesting because it can very effectively complement our own data gathering and analysis methodologies, because obviously practitioners, activists, and people who are influenced among specific constituencies will be best positioned to inform on the specific trends and tactics they are seeing in their communities. And perhaps just to elaborate a bit more on the sort of COVID-19 monitoring, I think what's quite specific to this crisis and also to its scale is really the influence of conspiracy theories because of the severity of the crisis, obviously the lack of alternative answers to make sense of it, but also the somehow very legitimate concerns and questions on decision makers' ability to act appropriately, and this make these conspiracy theories particularly difficult to debunk because they are basically filling a vacuum and yeah, they are making sense of the whole crisis. And beyond the pre-existing, I mean, what we obviously analyze historically is the sort of leveraging of hateful speech combined with disinformation that targets specific communities as scapegoats. And we all know, you know, this is always very effective, particularly during crisis times. But beyond that, during the COVID-19 crisis, we have also seen, in terms of new trends, we have also seen really entire conspiracy communities that used to be fringe, especially in a European context, perhaps less so in a US context, really gain influence on social media and manage to penetrate the mainstream. So some of them might be using, you know, naturalist, xenophobic, anti-government or anti-technology or anti-elite arguments. But what they have in common is that they provide an alternative to this vacuum left by the lack of authoritative explanation about this pandemic. And that's why it makes them really, really difficult to challenge. Yeah, so yeah, I also mentioned the role played by influencers. And I think the problem with that, and it has been exposed quite extensively in the media, but the problem is that they can play a role in either spreading disinformation intentionally, but you know, by sometimes using conspiracy theories as gateways, but they can also sometimes unintentionally amplify the influence of misinformation without necessarily noticing at first. And this issue is really important because it's sort of brought to the fore the fact that the information ecosystem is somehow distorted, and that we really need to collectively work with technological companies so we rebalance the playing field, so authoritative sources are prioritized, and I know that they have done a lot of efforts on that. I would be happy to elaborate more, but I don't want to take too much time.
Thank you, Iris, and thanks for speaking to the research methodologies and strategies that ISD is currently engaging with. The digital analysis unit, for example, seems like a very important tool in this cause. Dave, perhaps we can come to you in focusing on how anti-Semitism specifically ties into these trends. CST has put together a great report on anti-Semitic conspiracies amid the COVID-19 crisis. Could you take us through some of the narratives you've observed? And perhaps can you also speak to how CST is navigating the security aspect of your work now that there's been an increasing shift to the online sphere? How has your work changed in this regard?
Sure, thank you, Ilan, and hello everybody. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism can adapt to pretty much any situation that the world throws at us, whether it's a war or terrorism or economic decline, or in this case, a pandemic. So when the coronavirus started to spread, especially into Europe, we started looking for what narratives the kind of anti-Semitic activists and extremists that we're familiar with online would start developing and promoting in order to explain this completely new and for most of us unprecedented situation. And unsurprisingly, they managed to come up with their own explanations, which maintained their anti-Semitic worldview. And it's very important to remember in all of this, anti-Semitism at one level is a prejudice, but in its most fully formed state is a conspiracy theory in and of itself, which attempts to always be able to explain anything happening in the world by recourse to its anti-Semitic core. And we found 5 stages, really, 5 narratives or five kind of levels to this coronavirus-related anti-Semitism. And these were particularly narratives that we found in right-wing extremist online spaces. And I'll come to other kind of things in a second, but These were 5 narratives really associated with the far right. The first one being that the whole pandemic is a hoax. It's all invented. There is no virus, there is no disease, and it's a hoax generated by Jews. And the second narrative, which is kind of a partner to this, once it became, and these began right at the start, really back in January, once it became harder to deny that there was really a virus and people really were getting ill, this then developed into another stage, which is that the coronavirus is real, but it was created, or it's being spread, or it's being encouraged by Jews. And both of these would then lead to the question, why? And the answer, there would be various answers. It would be, you know, to crash the economy. One answer would be to kill off, to reduce the world's population. I don't know why that would particularly be a Jewish goal, but for some it was. To impose some kind of globalist rule and bring down nations. Quite often these narratives would be expressed in terms of accusing Zionists rather than Jews, and quite often they would be focused on individual Jewish people rather than the Jews as a whole. So we'd get a lot of these conspiracy theories focusing on George Soros. We would get other ones focusing on Bill Gates, who got relabeled as a Zionist for the purposes of these conspiracy theories, because he was associated with efforts to find a vaccine. And of course, what you see is a lot of crossover, a lot of interconnection between different types of conspiracy theories with anti-Semitism. So the focus on Bill Gates would be a connection between anti-vaccine conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism. We would also see a lot of conspiracy theories about 5G mobile phone signals being the true cause of the illness that is caused by the coronavirus. Now, these conspiracy theories about 5G mobile phone signals have been around for a few years. This is not new. When the pandemic began, this was the thing that a lot of these conspiracy theories turned to, and then you started getting a level of, well, why are there no 5G mobile phone masts in areas where Jewish people live, for example, is the kind of thing we started seeing on Facebook and so on. And again, a lot of times the anti-Semitism would be a minority within this conspiracy world, but it would be there and they would be connected. Then the other 3 narratives, I said we found 5 narratives. The other 3 were less associated with conspiracy theories and more with just really abject hatred, really. So the next one would be Jews are spreading the virus. Ordinary Jewish people are spreading the virus. They are responsible for it. And this speaks back to old anti-Semitic narratives that Jews are diseased. There are, a lot of Nazi propaganda in the 1930s and 40s was about Jews spreading disease. A lot of these activists even started labeling COVID-19 the Jew flu because of this association. The next stage would be, as stories started to appear in the UK, it may well be the same in other countries, but our research was focused very much on the UK. As stories started to appear at the start of the pandemic that the Jewish community in the UK was being disproportionately affected by COVID-19, that the number of Jewish people who died was maybe 3 or 4 times the proportion of Jews in the population as a whole. This would be celebrated in these far-right online spaces. The fact that Jews are dying, the fact that the Jews are getting the disease would be something really to rejoice about. And this then led to the climax, really, the peak of these narratives, which is, if you get COVID-19, go and cough on some Jews. Go to a synagogue, and we saw this with other minorities, go to a mosque, spread it to minorities. And these are just all ways in which known far-right actors and extremists took what's going on in society, what's going on in the world, and just adapted it to their perception of the world and of society. And we see this repeatedly with whatever's going on. I said there were other narratives away from the far right. One in particular that we have seen a lot of on online and on social media from extreme anti-Israel activists is association of Israel with the virus, an analogy that just as the coronavirus is a threat to mankind, or to humankind, sorry, so Israel is also a threat to every country, and every government should marshal all of its resources to trying to get rid of Israel the same way they are doing to try to get rid of the virus. And we saw a hashtag developing, hashtag COVID-1948, with 1948, of course, being the year of Israel's creation. Now, as well as developing online narratives, anti-Semitic narratives, people also develop ways to actually target the Jewish community. And this speaks to, Ilan, to the second thing you asked about, which is security during the pandemic. You know, CST, our core work is protecting the Jewish community from terrorism, from hate crime, from anti-Semitism. And in normal times, a lot of that work is about physically protecting buildings, supporting victims of anti-Semitism. It's guarding Jewish community events and so on, as happens, you know, for many Jewish communities across Europe. When these Jewish community events went online, so the harassment and abuse went online with them, and we had this new phenomenon of Zoom raiding or Zoom bombing, where, and we had quite a few cases of this. Synagogue services would be held on Zoom, as we are now, or learning events, other community events, and hostile people would get hold of the login details and come into the event and either start shouting anti-Semitic slogans, put anti-Semitic comments in the chat for the event, and so on. And we very quickly had to adapt our security to instructing the Jewish community how to protect against this. And whereas previously we've been focusing our efforts on on advising people, how do you prevent someone gaining access to your building? Now it was, how do you prevent someone hostile gaining access to your Zoom meeting? And it's a great shame, really, that this kind of activity really limited and continues to limit the openness with which Jewish communities can operate. And I think this is the real impact of anti-Semitism, whether it's online or offline, is the way in which it forces Jewish communities to kind of close down and close in on themselves, and prevent others from coming in and from sharing Jewish community life. It's constant balance to try and maintain that openness while reducing the anti-Semitic impact. One thing I would say, just finish off, is we're kind of starting to creep back to normal, or to a new normal now. Things are opening up in our communities. And as such, we may well see the kind of old style of anti-Semitism and the old hate crime of last year coming back, but with these new narratives about the pandemic still there as an added layer for them to feed off.
Thank you, Dave, for that really descriptive overview. I think it's important, while we all are kind of aware that conspiracies are circulating out there, to really be able to verbalize how these constitute real trends that exist out there. So that was very informative. Maybe just to spontaneously bring in Sergey, perhaps it would be interesting just to very shortly hear a little bit about some of the far-right elements we've seen in Germany, with the hygiene march, with the attacks on political parties receiving weird substances at their headquarters, together with fascist messaging and so on, just to kind of complement what Dave was saying.
Well, thank you. I don't want to monopolize the panel, and I'm sorry I have to run up to that, so then you have plenty of time without me to discuss the issue. But yes, indeed, this is something very worrisome, and this is actually a continuity. There is a kind of a continuity coming from, I call it kind of an excitement spiral. It has to be, there should be always a topic about which certain groups have to be excited about and hyperventilating about. And it used to be, it was the refugee crisis, and now this kind of went smoothly, because nobody's talking about refugees and people on refuge anymore in Germany. Now everyone is talking about COVID-19, and therefore it's important for them to plug in. And it's not just the right wing, it's also the populists like the Alternative for Germany, whom we also have in our European Parliament, but they were looking for a role in the new narratives and under the new situations. And there was a kind of things getting together. On the one hand, impact from outside, narratives coming from Russia, and being a Russian speaker, I see this very clearly, how much of those disinformation, Euro animosity, but also conspiracy thinking is coming in Russian, but also in German. And at the same time, there are recipients who are willingly endorse that because they can use it also for their political capital. Now they have a topic. Now they can attack Merkel. And I'm not from the Merkel party, but it's obvious that it's being instrumentalized and used. So it's kind of used as an attack on the liberal democratic values. Yet again, just under a different pretext. So this is something that we see. There are these demonstrations, and again, there is a mixture. There are also people who walk there because they say, our basic rights are being, our fundamental rights are being infringed, and we would support such people walking in other countries. It's difficult to say, you shouldn't walk and protest against assembly, infringement of your assembly rights. But at the same time, it's very difficult to imagine that someone who's really liberal in his or her attitude, liberal democratic in his or her attitude, are marching together with right-wingers, with anti-Semites, with conspiracy theorists who represent really the worst political range in our society. So it's a very difficult situation that we're facing. Let's see where it comes. And I am very concerned, before I disappear from this panel, I'm also very concerned about the potential, how it is going to happen in the future, because I think that the real crisis, the real hardship, especially in Germany, is not, many people have not felt it. We're coming into a real huge economic crisis with a lot of shifts also internationally. And this is where I worry about the ways of how people, ordinary people who will be affected, will be reacting. So a lot of responsibility for all of us sitting here. And I'm looking forward to joining forces in combating all those risks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sergey. Thank you for joining us. And I think particularly you are always wonderful at painting a broad picture and being able to show to people how different topics that society is dealing with at any point or another are fitting together. So thank you so much for providing that angle. And indeed, we are also looking forward to working together on this in the future. What I think is becoming clearer and clearer as we progress in the conversation is particularly this interconnectedness between anti-Semitism and various other types of thinking, which I think also makes it particularly important to have this interdisciplinary approach. So I'm really glad that we're able to have Milan and Google represented today here, and to the extent that you can also be a proxy more generally for IT companies. I think having that perspective of how IT companies are dealing with the current situation is really, really interesting. I think correct and accessible information is more relevant now during the pandemic than ever before. So I'm wondering what have been some of the challenges you've been confronting, and also some of the ways that you've managed to address this. Also perhaps reflecting on the points that Iris was already mentioning earlier.
Yes, thank you, Alina, Ilan, and thank you so much for inviting me to this distinguished panel. And I think it's also good to start appreciating all the work that everyone is doing to address this pandemic, from healthcare workers and essential workers to public health authorities, and also NGOs and others who are trying to fight anti-Semitism, hate speech, and disinformation that is connected to this. And us as a company are trying to play a responsible part in this, and be it by providing technology such as some of you might have heard about the exposure notification APIs that we are providing to governments together with Apple to help tracing the spread of the disease, helping people work and study remotely safely, which is something that they've alluded into, and also helping users to find useful information, which is a topic of today's discussion. So let me focus on that. Our work in this area revolves around two pillars. First is to promote authoritative content, and the second one is to fight the harmful disinformation. When it comes to the first pillar, apart from displaying authoritative results on Google search, we've built special tools and panels and sites with relevant information about the virus. This includes information from public health authorities such as WHO, local ministries, and this is now available in most of the, let's say, European languages, speaking about the EU here specifically. On YouTube, whenever somebody is looking for health-related results, we are trying to provide authoritative sources at the top of the results and also in the Watch Next panels. We also have a dedicated panel that many of you have probably seen on YouTube whenever you're looking for something that is related to COVID-19. So whenever the systems see that the query is related to COVID-19, there's a special panel activated with information from health authorities. And this panel has delivered already over 20 billion impressions from users who see and who may interact with this panel to get really authoritative information from authorities. As a result of all those efforts, and this is something that we are doing together with publishers and with others, is really to promote authoritative content. And we are seeing that people tend to interact with this authoritative content. They really want to see results from authoritative information. We've seen the increase by more than 75% when it comes to interactions with authoritative content. So of course, the harmful content is still out there, and I will talk about how we are addressing this. But generally, we see that people, when it comes to the pandemic, they want to receive authoritative information. In order to do so, we've been also working, as I said, with publishers, with small and medium media houses, because we need those partners that can put the useful information out there, so that we can really focus on putting this up. Now, when it comes to addressing the harmful content on YouTube, we are prohibiting dangerous remedies and cures. So, for instance, videos. Somebody mentioned this example: videos that would motivate people to use harmful substances such as drinking bleach. These are videos that we would remove. Videos that promote rituals over cures and medical treatment. Even videos that would be saying that social distancing is not useful and is not working. Those videos we will be taking down. We've reviewed over 2 million videos, and we took down over 200,000 videos that are related to dangerous and misleading coronavirus information since February. We're also updating the systems when it comes to recommendations to really prevent the spread of harmful misinformation via the recommendation systems. This is something that we've been hearing before, and we've been engaging with the civil society on how we can improve the recommendation systems so they don't provide and they don't lead people towards extreme results. So we are tweaking the algorithms, and we've made over 30 changes since 2019 to really improve the recommendation system, so that people don't get recommendations to divisive or even borderline content that might be harmful in this sense. It's interesting. We just discussed this with our colleagues that between March and May, we have not really observed notable increases in hate speech when it comes to YouTube. But of course, we are actively monitoring for the threats around COVID-19 content to ensure the enforcement works well. Maybe another example. This is still more about the sort of health-related disinformation, but as Dave and Iris and others pointed out, there's a lot of interaction. It's hard to say it's only about disinformation. It's only hate speech. These things are very much interconnected, and we have policies to address all of those. But it's also important to focus on those borderline cases. So, for instance, when it comes to ads and shopping, we treat COVID-19 as sensitive events, which means that private advertisers cannot advertise against COVID-19. So they cannot use this wording to advertise. We are making exceptions for public health authorities. So we learned when we banned all the ads for COVID-19, we quickly learned that, you know, health ministries, NGOs, health authorities want to have opportunities to advertise. So we lifted the ban for them. So we have a whitelisted approach where competent authorities can advertise to, you know, spread information about the cures, about testing, about prevention of diseases, etc., etc. And again, we have similar approaches to shopping, to play, and to maps, and to really, you know, I think important here is to say this is like what we are seeing is unprecedented when it comes to scale, when it comes to the topic. But many of those things are not really new. Disinformation has always been there. We've been always fighting disinformation. Conspiracy theories have always been there. When it comes to health disinformation, it's sometimes even easier to address it because we have a very strong authoritative sources. We can say whatever WHO says, we can take it as an authoritative source. When it comes to conspiracy theories, that is, you know, where the line is getting often blurred. And this is where we need to walk the fine line between securing preserving the freedom of expression and also addressing the illegal content, not just by taking things down, but also by reducing the reach, by working with experts, by working with fact-checking organizations and with others to really promote this type of information. We started doing this with the code of practice. And if you look at what we've been saying since we signed the code of practice on disinformation, it was, again, promoting authoritative content and fighting disinformation. So the key principles are very much still relevant and very much in place. We need to be vigilant. We need to keep updating the policies to, you know, address the new emerging threats. As an example, we never seen videos before about 5G being used to spread coronavirus. Once we saw this, we needed to, you know, update the policies to be able to address this because we saw that this is becoming, again, very harmful. It has become threatening and harmful also in the offline world with people attacking workers, with people attacking the 5G masts. So that's the reaction that we needed to take, you know, to include this type of disinformation into our policies, so that we could enforce and we could take an action on those types of videos. So let me stop here. This is just really a quick overview of all the different actions that we've been taking. And I'm happy to address any specific questions and sort of have a conversation about some of the examples and cases, especially when it comes to the conspiracy theories moving on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Milan, for the overview. I think especially for those who are working in Jewish advocacy and are rather coming to this meeting from the interest point of anti-Semitism, learning more about the technical aspects of how the online space is working, where clearly that's a place where we're seeing a lot of anti-Semitism, is really, really useful. I thought it was very interesting what you said, that while conspiracies are exploding, at the same time, people are more than usual willing to accept authoritative content and looking for authoritative information. So that's definitely an interesting contrast. I want to move a little bit back to specifically the issue of anti-Semitism and go to Katerina. They've laid out very well these anti-Semitic tropes that have come to the forefront. And I wonder whether the institutional tools that we currently have at our disposal are, from your perspective, suited to address this. I wouldn't say new challenge of conspiracy. Certainly it's not new, but it definitely very much exacerbated in this period. So do you feel like we're currently equipped to deal with that?
Well, I think that when it comes to the legal basis for hate speech, we have a good legal basis, but as always, it's with regards to the application that is decisive as to whether things are really effective. And I believe that also within the context, the larger context of tackling disinformation and also conspiracy myths, the tools are now underway with, for example, the support of the fact checkers, but also specifically in the disinformation communication, with regards to conspiracy myths, there is a mention of anti-Semitism in this communication. And with regards to hate speech more generally, there is a mention also with regards to ethnic and religious groups and racism and xenophobia. So there has been a focus that goes beyond the health issues and tackles this more generally, which will be a good entry into saying we need to dismantle conspiracy myths in in a broader sense, that target ethnic and religious groups specifically. So I think it's there, but what now needs to be developed is really the concrete action to put these things into practice. And then there is the other aspect on which the Commission has been working for quite a long time, the prevention of radicalization, which in my opinion really is very closely linked. And there, I mean, we have improved certainly the collaboration and the cooperation between the member states on the prevention of radicalization. We've also, the rapid alert system for disinformation supports this, and so. But again, we need to upscale our actions, and I think there's also one important aspect, which is also part of the communication on disinformation, strengthening the link between the fact checkers and law enforcement, because that they are the ones that see when things are developing on the ground, and they probably even have been monitoring certain action from individuals for some time, and they see how they evolve and what kind of networks they have. We've now, for example, also commissioned a specific research into how networks of right-wing extremists develop online, because I think it's important to understand this in order to address it. But we also know that fact checkers often are reluctant to go to the police and to say, I've seen this and that, So I think there is this is an important part that needs to be strengthened, that they have a trusted entry door to where to go to pass on information. So, yeah.
Thank you, Katerina. And I think it's great to see that already there is some link between the Commission, the platforms, through things that you are mentioning now, such as sponsoring fact checkers that then are being that are working in partnership with. You are muted if you want to add something.
If I can just add also, I mean, we've had, including also with the umbrella organizations in Brussels, discussions on the impact of COVID on anti-Semitic conspiracy myths online. And we will now have on the 17th of June, the working group on anti-Semitism, where we bring together the member states, the 27 member states and representatives from different ministries with the Jewish community. And we want to discuss also anti-Semitism and COVID, plus the support for victims and the IRA definition. So I think it's very important to bring these two together, that when someone is also online attacked with regards to anti-Semitic conspiracy myths, the victim doesn't have to explain why it is anti-Semitic, but the office to where they go, or the people to whom they report automatically understand that. So this is why I think it's very important to also have that link with regards to not only the law enforcement, but then also those who support specific groups of victims.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we already touched on some important tools, let's say, and maybe just adding to this, let's say, tool set, maybe we can speak a little bit about the importance of data and how this fits into the discussion. I know that the Institute for Strategic Dialogue has been able to look at some disaggregated data. So not just the bulk of information collected online, but what it specifically says. So perhaps you could share a little bit of what you have seen on that front, Iris, as this usually really tends to be a challenge. Again, this question of privacy versus, really understanding what's out there is always challenging, but perhaps there's a best practice there.
Absolutely, yeah. The access of data is a huge challenge. Thank you for outlining the challenge here and the balance with privacy and freedom of speech as well. So what we try to do with our digital analysis unit is really using, as I was saying earlier, a combination of commercial and bespoke tools. So we use commercial tools, like typically tools used in marketing context, let's say, that aggregates publicly available social media data. So only looking at open API, like open groups and profiles, basically to analyze broad trends in discussion and how they may be influenced by hateful groups and disinformation. So that's kind of the start of our journey when we use commercial tools. And then basically drawing from a really wide array of data sources. And I mentioned earlier, our usage or leveraging of crowdsourced model for data sharing, but it also includes ethnographic research by our expert researchers into specific closed groups. So drawing from this wide array of data sources and trying really to circumvent this data access issue that you mentioned, we try to really gather insights into the specific topics of discussions online, both broadly, and also within specific fringe or extremist cycles or discussion groups. Another thing we are able to do is really to map out online networks to identify key influencers in these extremist or conspiracist ecosystems. And we can also trace how content moves through these networks. So that's really helpful to paint a comprehensive picture of how these theories basically travel online. And finally, using natural language processing tools that we have co-developed in partnership with the Center for Analysis of Social Media, we are also able to analyze specific types of hateful speech online. So this is really helpful because of the nature of hateful speech, which doesn't always enable to rely massively only on automated identification system and where we always need a human review. So basically we are able to identify by training algorithm on which decision to take over time, we are able to identify where speech comes from, yes, but also try to establish whether they are hateful and try to establish their scale also. And in some geographies, we are also able to geolocate these posts to identify areas that may need intervention from either grassroots actors or governments in prevention policies. And so we try to always use these insights to either help policymakers craft and inform their policy responses to hate and disinformation, but also help communities mount responses at the local level within their communities. So really the ambition is this ambition of creating early warning mechanisms, that was mentioned before. And some of the few findings, just briefly, that I can outline. Basically, something we have particularly noticed is really the need to invest more efforts into mixed methodologies, as I was mentioning. So really trying to mix and reconciliate ethnographic research into specific closed groups with like the more big data or macro analysis to be able to have this picture at scale as well, because you can't only rely on this anecdotal evidence. Otherwise, it might give a very distorted picture, and we might think extremism or conspiracy theories are everywhere just because we are spending a lot of time in these not so welcoming groups. Another challenge is obviously the moderation, which is really needed, obviously, but it causes a challenge for researchers because you can't basically analyze content that has already been moderated, and in specific subsets, and anti-Semitism might be one. We have found that actually using, our keyword list, keywords-based list queries, we were not finding actually a lot of anti-Semitic content, which might indicate that anti-Semitism, when it's keywords-based, is relatively well moderated on online platforms, at least on publicly available content, not on, I don't know, in closed groups. But so it also shows how challenging it is, and Dave mentioned that before, to basically identify at scale really abject, hateful speech that is quite subtle in its techniques and doesn't necessarily use the typical hateful slurs, but perhaps uses analogies or pictures or memes or even songs. So this is also an important finding that we always try to keep in mind when drafting research strategies. And then finally, perhaps the intersectional nature of either conspiracy speech or hateful speech, really. So in the case of anti-Semitism, obviously, we mentioned the intersection with anti-Zionism, but it can be also with anti-elite narratives, sometimes with very specific political, Islamist extremism. So this also causes serious challenges. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you, Iris.
I stopped really abruptly.
Thank you for speaking.
Sorry, I was done. Bad transition.
Not at all. I think my colleague Ilan is struggling a little bit with the internet connection, maybe. So I'll just take it forward then. We wanted to let Milan reflect a little bit on this question of disaggregated data, how social media companies could make more such data available, because if we don't know exactly what hate looks like online, it's very difficult to actually come up with solutions.
Thank you, Alina. It's as you say, it's a very important question, and generally the topic of transparency has always been critical for us. I think one of the first, Google has been one of the first companies that came up with the transparency reports, and we've been expanding the topic and the content of those transparency reports over time. Now you can see quarterly reports on the enforcement of community guidelines on YouTube. So you see data on how many videos we've reviewed, we've taken down. We're trying to expand, the areas on which we report, and this is where the conversation with all the different stakeholders is critical, to really sort of understand and to see how we can be more open, how we can provide more insights and more data. That would also comply with a very strict privacy requirements. What is the level of anonymization, where still, there's no way to sort of re-anonymize the data, but also when it's still useful, because if you anonymize the data to a large extent, then the usefulness already lacks. And also I think it is mentioned important point, how to reveal information that can be useful for certain groups without not revealing too much to the bad actors, because we see that the bad actors are learning. They're learning how to walk the line of what is against the community guidelines and we take action, and what is not. how to connect, and we also see the content sort of travel from the more moderated platforms to the platforms that are not so moderated. So this is also a progress that we are seeing, and that's why it's so important to work together as the whole industry, not just as a handful of online platforms, but really work so that we don't see the migration of the harmful content to less moderated platforms. When it comes to the disinformation, some of you might have seen that we worked with the Commission on the monthly reports before the May 2019 elections. So we started publishing reports on disinformation. Again, it's not that close to the topic of today's discussion, but there is some experience with reporting. You probably saw that that Vice President Jourova's announcement today. In the announcement, one of the calls was to online platforms to start submitting monthly reports. So this is something that we are currently analyzing, and we are looking into ways how we can report on useful data and information on what we are seeing when it comes to disinformation and COVID-19. We also look forward to part of the announcement was the European Digital Media Observatory that Katarina already mentioned, which should serve as a sort of platform for cooperation between researchers and online platforms on how we can really work out ways how we can work together and share the useful information. So hopefully this will prove to be a valuable platform for this type of cooperation, because as I said in the beginning, unfortunately there are some constraints that we are seeing, especially when it comes to privacy obligations. So we really want to make sure that we are useful, but also of course as a company we need to follow very strict privacy principles.
Thank you very much for speaking to that, Milan. Katarina, perhaps I could bring you in at this point. The often referenced FRA, Fundamental Rights Agency survey on perceptions of anti-Semitism in Europe showed us that the online medium is the main place where Jews experience anti-Semitism. Therefore, Katarina, if I could ask, what's your reflection with regard to this data scarcity and data collection question that we're experiencing at this moment?
Yes, I think it is very important to ensure that, if we want to have more transparency, we need to have better data collection. The FRA survey that you mentioned took place in 2018, so long before this crisis, and already then the anti-Semitic attacks that Jews perceived were mainly online. So I believe it's in order to understand what's going on and how harmful it can be towards a community, we need to have better analysis, and we need to break it down with regards to the different groups, the different areas. Is it if we, for example, would regroup all religious and ethnic groups together, I'm not so sure it's so useful. I think we need to break things down in a deeper level. And for that, for example, the IRA definition, the so-called definition of anti-Semitism by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, that was agreed in 2016 and has been used by a lot of member states, would be a very helpful bias indicator for what is anti-Semitism. That then doesn't necessarily yet mean that something is legal or illegal. That has to be decided in a second step. The definition itself is non-legally binding, but it at least shows what is anti-Semitic. And then one can also decide, do I want to leave this content on while knowing it's anti-Semitic? It can be harmful, but it is not illegal, or do I do something with it and put up a fact checkers wall or something? So I think it's very important to understand the different forms of anti-Semitism that we see from the right, from the left, from Islamists, conspiracy myths in the middle of society, and then use that as a starting point. And that would be something that the platforms could easily do. in my view, to use this definition as a basis.
Thank you, Katerina. And I think that could potentially be a great action point. I think it's already been circulated for a while, and it's always this push and pull between the IT companies and civil society working on combating hate speech, each with valid concerns. But I think this is definitely a great point to underline, having a clear point of reference. All right, so we've talked about a lot of challenges. Some best practices already came through, but as we move towards the later part of our conversation, I'd like to turn to the positive and the constructive and speak a little bit about some best practices and how we can better engage together. So there will be one question for each of you. And maybe I'm going to start with Iris. When we first spoke, you described the Institute of Strategic Dialogue as a think and do tank. And you yourself are working at this intersection between research and engaging with civil society. So perhaps you could share a few constructive solutions that you've seen engaging with civil society in training and teaching.
Thanks. Yeah, so you already mentioned the challenges, obviously, and so I think what's particularly difficult to nail is how we really try to initiate a dialogue, a constructive dialogue, to create, commonality and plant a seed of doubt. Or also how we expose the arguments and the disingenuous arguments of malign actors and their tactics. I mean, I don't have, a golden solution, but perhaps just a few avenues and food for thought, because it's, at the end of the day, it's really difficult to deconstruct entire belief systems. That's basic, especially when they provide a solution to another belief system that is considered as failed by this community. So basically, we also need to provide solutions that are proportionate to these, traumatic issues with the most hardcore audiences. And this is another parallel track. But perhaps some avenues. So I think interesting solutions is definitely really doubling down our efforts into really designing or co-designing original and well-targeted authoritative content, coupled with innovative and engaging communication strategies. And really, for instance, we mentioned content prioritization by the companies, and these are really, really important efforts. But perhaps to go a bit further, what we could do is for governments and companies to really support and help authoritative resources, organizations that are sometimes, under-resourced or not necessarily super, tech savvy, or not necessarily super used to talk to young communities that are at risk of, conspiracy theories. Really help them and their frontline actors get the message out and get it out smartly and effectively. So, for instance, I know there are a few initiatives looking at opportunities to pairing, nurses with influencers, or people who work in health-related fields with, TikTok influencers or Instagram or YouTube influencers. So this could be an interesting avenue. And perhaps more generally and even more importantly, as a long-term solution, we absolutely need to focus more on the mainstreaming of preventative education provision with digital citizenship education resources and trainings for different constituencies. And ideally, really, this should be embedded at the educational curricula level, at the national level. And really, the ambition with this programming is not for beneficiaries to just be media literate, but to really actually become active digital citizens and making sure that they are keen organically, they want to stop being bystanders and they are keen to take part into the collective effort. I think this is really important and something where I would love to see more investments from decision makers in the different sectors.
Thank you very much, Iris, and absolutely the need for proactive engagement when addressing these issues is particularly important. Dave, perhaps I can come back to you. As a British Jew myself, indeed, the role that CST plays, from my experience, is particularly important, visible, and, as we said, proactive. And as you spoke to earlier, for instance, at CST, you have such a comprehensive methodology with heavy volunteer engagement, intercommunal partnerships, training, advocacy, and other methods in place. What best practices can you share that you think could be more intensely replicated across the EU, for instance?
I'm always hesitant to advise other communities in other countries how to operate, but because everyone has very different environments, very different contexts, different possibilities in terms of their own community and other potential partners. But what I will do is explain a few principles about how CST operates and that have worked for us in the UK. The absolute core principle is that you have to operate in a way that keeps and maintains consent and credibility in your own community, but also with key partners outside it. I mean, you know, Jewish defence in the UK goes back many decades, and CST is the outcome of many different organisations and initiatives and campaigns over many years, which have come together into the organisation we are today. But one thing that connected all of those successful initiatives, there have been many that didn't really work so well, but all the ones that worked is because they genuinely came from within the community. And we have a lot of volunteers, as you say, who are across the country, and they're all part of their local communities. They're not, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean they're all members of a synagogue or whatever. We operate completely cross-communal, whatever people's level of religious observance or not, or political views, whatever they are. But essentially, you have to be embedded within your community to get that community's agreement to work with you and to trust you, really. When you're talking about security, when you're talking about defending against anti-Semitism, there's an enormous element of trust because, you know, genuinely at times people's lives are at stake. And the same goes for partnerships outside the community, I would say. You know, in the UK, we have fantastic relationships with government and police around the country. That may not always be possible in every country. We're working very hard to build partnerships with other communities who also face hate crime and face terrorism, and seeing what we have in common. We have a project now called SAFE, which is exists to effectively train other communities in how to protect their places of worship from terrorism and hate crime in the same way the Jewish community does, as a way of building those partnerships and those relationships outside the Jewish community. And again, those relationships have to be based on trust. That whoever you're talking to knows that you can be relied upon to deliver what you say you're going to deliver, to talk about anti-Semitism in a way that is objective and calm, that isn't looking for, you know, quick headlines and then you move on to the next thing, and that we won't embarrass people and we won't let them down, or at least we'll try our best not to. And in that way, you build up credibility, and it's a long-term piece of work, really, to develop that credibility and get that trust, so that people will listen to you and work with you. I think the other part of it, I think that's very important, is working out what are your priorities. You know, again, for CST, our priority is protecting the community against, firstly, terrorism, and hate crime, and then secondly against what you might consider kind of political anti-Semitism, the attitudes and the views and the stereotypes in society that need changing. And there's lots of different ways to approach this. And I think it's very important just to have a really clear idea yourself of what your priorities are and what you're capable of, and how to communicate that, really. It's going to change. It's going to be different for everyone. And as in the UK, it will change all the time. I would say the situation we went through with anti-Semitism in the Labour Party last year as a mainstream political party is not something that that really we'd seen before, certainly for many years, or that many people had anticipated would be such a major feature of anti-Semitism in Britain. So the situation can change, but I think as long as you stick to those core principles, then it's possible to build something that will work and that will carry the community with you.
Thank you, Dave, for that overview. And I saw, Katerina, you raised your hand.
Yes, I just wanted to say, I think Dave has been very modest in explaining the role that the CST has. I mean, looking from our point of view, also as policymakers, I would say that the CST has been the role model for the role a community organization can have as an in-between between law enforcement and victims and data collection and security, and bringing all this together. And we see now, and we've been also sharing this as a best practice with other member states, and we see that different member states are in fact modeling their community organizations on the CST. So just to make that sure.
Well, while we're at you, Katerina, perhaps then I can ask you, building on that and reflecting on how CST has been really a best practice, how could civil society be more active partners in dealing with this challenge of conspiracies, but also generally engaging with the different actors we have here today?
Yeah, so I think, in fact, I mean, one of our principles in this whole fight against anti-Semitism has been to very closely work with the different, NGOs, but also community organizations, and to really listen to their assessment and their ideas, and see in how far this can be part also of the policy making. And we think that this approach is absolutely necessary. We see that things work best when the communities, first of all, work together, which is not always easy, yeah, but they are very complementary. And I had my experience when I first called a roundtable some 5 years ago with the umbrella organizations in Brussels, and one organization said, well, if that one's coming, then I may not, and so on. In the end, all came, and I think it's been of benefit to see that everyone is working in different fields, and actually it's very complementary. So this is a challenge, I know, but I think it's also a great asset. And then I believe that the community organizations can be very helpful when it comes to the contacts with their member state authorities. So if you have, if you can establish good contacts within the education ministry, within the police, the security, or also the Ministry of Interior, it really helps to ensure that there is a good dialogue. And part of the work we do also in Brussels by bringing together the member states authorities with the Jewish communities is to support that. And maybe the third aspect is to show the vibrant Jewish life in Europe, because I believe that it's really important not only to fight, but also to have this positive message of how diverse the Jewish community are, how they contribute, how they have the general society in the picture when they act, and that it's not only about the community itself, but it has a contribution more widely to society. So I think these three things together are already a lot on your plate, and the close cooperation we have is also has been very beneficial also for the Commission's work.
Thank you very much, Katerina, and absolutely. Cohesion, consensus, cooperation forms the basis of proper action on this issue. Milan, if I can come back to you, there often seems to be a sense of antagonism between IT companies and civil society dealing with hate. But this is not the full picture, I wouldn't say, and there are certainly also strong points of cooperation, as have been mentioned. What are best practices you'd share in this regard, and how can civil society perhaps play a bigger role?
Thank you, Ilan. And you're absolutely right. The cooperation from our point of view is absolutely critical, because we cannot do these things alone. We continue to invest in the network of over 180 organizations across the policy areas, so-called trusted flaggers, that are helping us to flag the content that is either illegal or against our community guidelines, including, of course, hate speech. Every participant in the Trusted Flagger program receives training enforcing the community guidelines. These trainings are continuous. We keep trusted flaggers posted and keep them briefed on what are the sort of changes in our policies, what are new trends, and of course receiving feedback, and very valuable feedback from the trusted flaggers that we are also implementing. And I would say that, of course, if you look at YouTube, every single user can flag the content to us. Where we see the value of trusted flaggers is the quality of the flags. If you look at the flags from individual users, of course the scale is bigger because anyone can flag, but the quality of flag is much smaller. When it comes to the flags from trusted flaggers, we see the quality is much higher, which is a very important sort of reflection for us. And then, of course, our human reviewers still review those flags, but we can prioritize those flagged to us by trusted flaggers. And what is the important aspect of this is that whatever decision our human reviewers make, we can feed into the machine, and we can improve the machine learning, so that the machine learning systems are getting better and better in identifying potentially illegal content or harmful content, so that it is helping our human reviewers. So this is the process of continuous improvement where trusted flaggers' role is critical. And a good example of our cooperation with civil society is the Code of Conduct on Hate Speech that we signed back in 2016 together with the European Commission and several other online platforms. And we've done now, I think, 5 monitoring rounds in this Code of Conduct. We committed to review majority of the flag content within 24 hours. And since there are monitoring exercises, everyone can see what are the trends, and we can see the improving trend in terms of the speed with which we review the content, and you can see the progress also by including other platforms and by expanding the number of trusted flaggers and the cooperation we're working with. Finally, we are also, of course, not only working on flagging the content, but as was said also before by my colleagues, also on the counter narratives and the counter speech. So working together with NGOs on how we can promote the counter narratives, how we can promote the counter speech, which is an extremely part of the whole equation, because just taking the content down is not a solution.
Alina, if I can add something really quickly. Thank you so much. Yeah, I didn't mention earlier because I didn't want to do any self-promotion for ISD, or I was also expecting Milan might be talking about it, but on the programming side of things, ISD is extremely lucky to have received some really valuable support from YouTube and Google.org on the digital citizenship education programming side of things. In fact, Google was one of the first company to invest in our efforts building digital resilience, with one program in the UK called Be Internet Citizens and a pan-European program called Young Digital Leaders. And this work is extremely important.
Thank you so much, Iris. And I think we really collected a lot of important, positive, constructive points. The code of conduct was mentioned. I saw that today TikTok announced that they're going to join. The importance of creating counter speech and positive, authoritative, and creative content. The importance of digital citizenship education and reinforcing digital resilience. As well, the importance of really being in touch with the community and receiving legitimacy from the community, listening to the community and taking its cues, bringing different elements of the community together, as well being in touch and really forcing the partnership with member states. And to save my favorite for last, really focusing as much as possible on positive and vibrant Jewish identity. I think we saw that this whole question of conspiracies spreading and online safety is really a multidisciplinary topic and such an interconnected issue. So we were really grateful to have such a diverse group of experts to speak to the topic. We're really grateful to have had MEP Sergei Lagodinsky join us in the beginning. And thank you so much to Katarina, Milan, Iris, and Dave for joining us today, but also for all the work you're doing every day. There's a lot of food for thought, and we really look forward to materialize it together moving forward. To everyone out there watching, thank you for joining us, and hope to see you all soon.
Thank you. Bye.
So much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.